Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is Chloë Lind, and I'm here with Brian Stroup, our Director of Solutions Architecture here at SVT Robotics. And if you are in operations or the IT team and looking to deploy automation, stick around. We're going to get into it, and you can walk away with a lot of great advice from somebody who has seen it all.
Absolutely.
So welcome. How you doing, Brian?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Appreciate it.
So just to level set here,
Sure.
a little bit about what you do at SVT.
Yeah. So like you said, I'm the Director of Solutions Architecture. And for SVT, Solutions Architecture is kind of a three-pronged approach. We support all of our sales operations teams, and that we're like the technical liaison for those groups. So we do a lot of requirement gathering, product demonstrations with our potential customers and also our partner base as well. Then we work on the project execution side. So we do all the specification writing and make sure we're developing test cases and everything that's appropriate to what we're trying to go deploy. And then lastly, we're also reporting through the product organization. And in that way, we are the market research arm of our product team. So we're bringing all of the information that we're gathering in the field on both the sales and the project side back to our product team to hopefully incorporate it back into our product and ultimately improve our platform.
And before you joined SVT,
Yep.
I believe you worked at a systems integrator.
Yeah. So I've been in the automated material handling space since August of 2017. I worked for a large systems integrator. I started as just a business analyst. So I was doing discrete projects and sales support, gathering requirements, writing specifications, all the labor intensive stuff that nobody likes to do. I was doing all of that, worked my way up, became a solution architect, and I've been working in that space ever since. I was the Director of Solution Architecture prior to leaving and joining SVT in January of 2022.
And just to give a little bit of color there,
Sure.
what types of projects were you working on? What
Yeah.
types of use cases? What types of customers?
Yeah. So I mean, my experience ranges all across a lot of different use cases. So I have a ton of experience with that. With that particular company, I was working a lot on pallet technology, both in a crane and a pallet shuttle environment, and all of the different supporting peripheral technologies, monorails, right, AGVs, different things that help support pallet movement throughout warehouses. I was also working on several goods to person applications, so different tote picking type applications or mobile racking applications for specifically delivering goods and to an individual for either put away or picking. And then we were also doing a little bit of light goods and like sortation type applications, things of that nature. So kind of a wide range, pretty diverse across overall supply chain in general. I wouldn't say I spent any one great area in one of those versus another. So pretty diverse. And my experience is all on the software, the WES, WCS side of those solutions. So all of the software and the logical business processes that are supporting those physical robotic equipment and the material handling equipment itself.
And this might seem like an obvious question, but just in case anybody here isn't aware, why would somebody reach out for support in deploying automation? Is that something that they can do in-house?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, right, you got to find somebody who's going to supply you the equipment, right? So unless you want to go out and start building pallet rack yourself. So I think that most customers, in my experience, they reach out because they're looking to gain an edge in their overall supply chain. So they're either trying to fit more into a certain amount of square footage. So in some cases, it's just about storage density. How can I compact as much material into a smaller space as possible? And your more traditional ASRS components are really the things that kind of feed those engines, allow you to, take what usually takes, 20,000 square feet and condense it down to 5,000 square feet. And you gain a magnitude of functionality within your building by condensing your storage that way. Other customers, I think, are interested to really gain efficiency on either their inbound or outbound processes or both. Looking to really figure out, okay, how can I get this trailer unloaded as quickly as possible to get the material put away? How can I maximize the amount of material presented to a singular operator at any one time, really in order to gain that efficiency, ultimately to move more product out the door, right? Because either the more you can move product, the faster you can get it to your customers, the more money you can ultimately make as a business, right? Because you're able to churn through orders in a quicker fashion. So Ultimately, I think that's what leads people down the road of trying to find their automation solution, and the perfect thing for them is, what is the business problem that they're trying to solve, and how are they trying to improve the efficiency in their building overall?
Okay. That makes sense. And particularly with, say a customer has, or, a company has selected specific technology. They decided they didn't want to build it themselves, right? And so they're going to go out and buy it.
Yep.
What's next, right?
Yeah.
You have a great new tech, you have
Sure.
existing system.
Sure.
And just make it work together, right?
Everybody tends, when they go on an automation journey, they start to think about, well, how does this fit into my building? How does this fit into my normal operations? And one of the things that people have to consider is, how do I integrate it to my existing systems? I would say, 98 out of 100 warehouses in the States, especially, and worldwide really, are running some sort of WMS, right? Some sort of warehouse management system that ultimately runs the entirety of the building. And ultimately, most companies now have an ERP that would sit over top of that. When you run into those situations, you want all of that data that's gained throughout the warehouse to end up flowing back into those systems for record keeping purposes, right? The accounting, the financials, all of it is maintained within those systems. And so in order to get to that point, you have to integrate the lower level of communication. And I don't think many people take into account all of the different steps that are required in order to make sure that data is flowing from the ultimate level of the ERP that is managing the global assets, all the way down to maybe just the singular picking robot that's responsible for filling one singular order. It's not necessarily that it's overlooked. It's just that it's always the last piece of the puzzle people think about. I think one of the beautiful parts about what SVT Robotics is doing is the fact that we're bringing that integration conversation to the forefront, trying to bring that forward as much as possible, because there's a lot of information to be gained on the upstream side of that when you begin projects in automation, as opposed to at the very end working to integrate them on site.
Yeah. And what are some of the challenges that people face when getting to that integration step?
Yeah, I think that the first and foremost challenge that most people run across is, how do I communicate with this particular piece of technology? So if you just took a really simplified use case and said, I want to integrate my WMS to this one small picking engine, it's an AMR picking solution. Well, you just have to be able to talk to it, right? The things that you need to give it is the information that it needs to succeed and to go do its job. And ultimately what that might be is just, all of the data about the order. So it's the item that you need to pick, it's how much of it you need to pick, and it's really, where do you need to go pick it from? All of those seem really simple on the surface, but then when you start talking about, well, what language do you speak? Oh, okay, I speak French, you speak German. Oh, okay, great. Well, what if we both speak German? That's awesome. Okay. Not good with languages. So let's just pretend we both speak English. So you might be from New York, right? And I grew up in Southeast Virginia. So we speak English, but we don't really speak the same dialect of English. Well, that's what APIs really are, right? So these standard protocols were developed as a way for two different systems to communicate with each other, but then they're not actually standard, right? So some might be a JSON format, some might be an XML format. The communication protocol, ultimately, whether or not you're sending it, as an example, right, as via email or via phone, right, or via text, some of those things could also be different as well. So when you drill down to it, that's the first challenge that people run into, it is just, how do I talk to this particular piece of technology? And that's a big barrier for people to solve, because if your communication protocol is different, that's a wholesale change for that system. So there's a whole different piece of infrastructure that now has to be changed and has to be modified. And so there's technical debt that's being taken on by either the customer themselves and the WMS, perhaps trying to bring that back to the WMS provider on their own, or even just the individual technology provider, right? So when you run into those situations, there's always going to be technical debt in those areas. You usually then run into the finger pointing game of like, are you going to change, or am I going to change? Are they going to change? And when you get to that point now, it's usually the person who has like the lowest hourly rate is the one that ends up taking on the change. So that's really what we've we've taken on has been the challenge in the industry, right, for the longest amount of time to try and solve.
Okay, and to tease that out a little bit, we talk about technical debt. You're implying that someone's going to have to spend a good amount of hours doing something.
Yeah, so like we talked about languages, right, and different communication protocols. So let's just take an example. If we were running down integrating that WMS to the particular pick robot provider, if I am a SOAP communication protocol and you're a REST communication protocol, well, we don't even speak the same language, that's fine. Now, if one of us decides to change, say yours like, okay, well, I'll start speaking REST. Okay, well, are you going to send XML messages? Or are you going to send JSONs? Once we get to that point, now at least I know how to read what you're sending when you agree to send me JSON messages. But then even at that point, I now have to get into the actual field level naming of everything. So if I call an order, but you call it a sales order, one of us now has to change because those fields are not calling the same thing. So you need a mapping mechanism. You need something that's going to do that translation. And again, most often it's somebody who is either the provider themselves, or it's going to be somebody who has got the lowest hourly rate that is now going to take on that technical debt to make all of those changes. And then additionally, that was just one field on one message for one workflow of a system that you're trying to get. Now imagine that you have a more complex integration with maybe a couple of different subsystems trying to connect to the same WMS, and a more streamlined integration of different technologies working together. Now multiply that by 4 or 5 or 6, right? And have however many messages, however many fields. And you can see that like the volume of this problem is not just down to like one small change. It is one small change that magnifies into a huge problem.
When you talk about changes and having to reconcile and create mappings, new technologies, not scalable, et cetera, you're incurring more technical debt, more development hours, resources. We're ending up with a lot of custom code, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
What are the long-term ramifications of that?
Well, I mean, you're not deploying the automation in your building just to get it live and running, right? You're deploying it to run for, in some cases, you want that to run for 15, 20 years. You want it to be the backbone of how you fulfill orders or how you pick different technologies for the next, decade. Well, inherently, things are going to go wrong. At some point, something is not going to work exactly correct. And when that happens, somebody now has to support it. So if you have a bunch of different custom integrations where not only do you have custom code, which is overall just not as stable, it's brittle. A lot of things can break within that code stream. But when you have all of these different bespoke integrations, now when somebody goes to just diagnose the problem, they immediately run into, all right, I have to spend the next 5 hours digging through all of this code to try and understand what's happening in the system, as opposed to being able to go straight to it. Oh, I've seen this integration 100 times because we do it the same way every time. So I typically know where to go diagnose, and so I'm faster to get to the problem. Because a lot of people who have worked in systems integration for a period of time would tell you that the amount of time it takes you to diagnose the problem is directly related to the amount of time it takes to fix the problem. Most people spend 5 hours hunting and 5 minutes fixing, right? So being able to get to the root of the problem faster is a main driver for why you want standardized solutions and high supportability solutions in place.
And could you describe, in your experience in this industry, deploying automation solutions, a moment when you realize sort of the magnitude of the ask?
Yeah. I joined my former employer directly after several large projects had gone live and had been sold. So I didn't get a chance myself to dig into those specific projects. But every time as a new person in that space and a new person at that company, you would hear the stories that people were telling. And for a period of time, I want to say it was my first year of working there, I didn't realize how large of a problem it was until I was about 2 years into my time there. And I started working on a project, I won't say of similar size, but of relative magnitude to the larger ones that the company had just finished. And I remember very distinctly that one of the first things that we were looking at in terms of this one project it was a very large pallet system. It involved a monorail used for transport, as well as a couple AGV providers. And we started realizing that not only did we have an issue with communicating with everyone, right, but we had all of these now different vendors that we were ending up being the central place that everyone was looking at to say, well, you guys are going to have to integrate to us. And so now, even outside the customer, we were the ones that were taking on a lot of technical debt on the project. And the majority of that was all technical debt that we had not foreseen necessarily, because we hadn't gone through the process of gathering those requirements well enough on the front end of the project to understand what it is that those vendors were going to ask of us. So I very vividly remember sitting in this little conference room in a corporate office and at the customer site, and having like a mild panic attack at the amount of not only custom code work that was going to have to be done on the project, and ultimately try and get accomplished within the next like 12 months, because the timeline was also extremely tight. But I was the one responsible for writing all of the specifications for it, and I was losing my cool a little bit in terms of, well, that's 5 different documents to 5 different vendors, not to mention the ultimate document to the customer system. And so now all of a sudden I have, 6 or 7 different integrations that I'm trying to balance. And not only from a know-how perspective, understand how they all work, but then like, what do I write down, and making sure I'm not crossing my wires. So there was a huge challenge for me, really only a couple years into like material handling in general, to understand that I have to manage all of these different expectations and manage all these different communication protocols. So I guess the thing that I learned is that in addition to it being a huge lift on the system, it was also a huge lift on the project team itself to be able to undertake the learnings and the understanding that it would take in order to make sure that we kept them all straight and did the right thing for each one, because they were all unique in how they approached the world. And we had to be the thing that taught them a singular lens. And our software platform wasn't capable really of doing that. So all of it became a custom integration. All of it became custom code. And it was very brittle, and it was a very difficult ask on the entirety of the project team.
And going back to what we were talking about before, even if all that's done to spec, everything's running super well,
Yep.
Should there be a change or an additional solution to be introduced at some later time?
Yeah, I mean, that process it's basically like almost starting at square one for some of those things, right? If somebody would have tried to change midstream on us on that project, we would have been in a world of trouble, just based upon the fact that everything was so rigidly defined. There was no fluidity in some of those requirements. It had to be this way or the highway. So when we ran into some of those challenges, there can be a lot of like difficult conversations with software engineers at that point, because you're going back to them after they've worked, 100 hours on this one piece and said, hey, sorry, I need you to change these aspects of it. A lot of those folks are not real pumped about having to redo their work. So had we had to adjust midstream, we would have been in a very, very bad situation. So thankfully we didn't have to do that on that particular project, but there were definitely times on other custom integration jobs that we had to make those kind of adjustments, and they were always very, very painstaking.
And imagine, we're talking about resources, just the level of work that goes into adapting to any sort of change. Can you speak to, at just the time what that looks like time-wise, right?
Yeah.
Because I'd imagine for a lot of people listening, speed to market, time to value are very, very important. Consideration. Yeah.
I mean, for a lot of people that are making these automation decisions, part of the challenge for making them is it's the largest capital investment that they'll make within their career. And so anytime that you're going to higher ups and saying, hey, we want to spend X about $1 million on a project, you're really staking your name to it. So when it comes to making those things and having to have other people now work downstream from there, I think that one of the biggest challenges is that they want it to be perfect. And so they're constantly assessing during the life cycle of the project. And the company I used to work at, there was a very long lead time in terms of long project life cycle. So our average project cycle was around 18 months, maybe longer. we ran into several challenges all the time of customers changing requirements. And it's because from the customer perspective, they say, well, things are different now than they were 6 months ago, 8 months ago. So they need to adjust that business requirement in order to meet the changing needs of their business. Well, we had a rigid specification. We had a rigid process defined. Now all of a sudden we're trying to get out of that and make adjustments where it's been maybe like halfway or 3/4 of the way coded. And now we have to go back and there's a lot of rework that's created. So there's extra cost that's now probably pushed back to the customer. There's extra time that's lost on the project. And then ultimately all of that puts the final go live in jeopardy. And when you're making such a large capital investment on that type of automation, that ultimate go live date is the thing that starts justifying the ROI. So you want to do everything you possibly can to hit that date, but you also need to hit that date and have the solution be perfect, right? So you're trying to really thread the needle in terms of what you're accomplishing there. And it's a difficult ask on any project team, on any company, on any systems integrator as well.
For operations teams that might be tuning in, that are looking to deploy automation by, say, peak, right? Like they have a certain time frame,
sure,
they have a project in mind. What questions should they be asking?
So I grew up working in warehouses. Like when I was in high school and college, I worked in several warehouses, even at like an amusement park, right? It's where I worked in the games warehouse hauling big teddy bears around. So I identify with those people and the labor that they go through, because those environments are hot, right? They're not easy to work in. And then all of a sudden you've been showing them to work for the past decade, doing it one way. And now all of a sudden somebody who doesn't even work in your building is going to bring in this newfangled automation that you're like, wait, how do I know how to do my job. I do my job well. I don't need this robot helping me out, right? So the questions you should be asking yourself when you're looking at those type of things are, how are my people going to interact with this? What is the impact on their day-to-day activities going to look like? Is it making their lives easier? Is it making their lives more difficult? And then ultimately, when you talk about things like who is impacted, you want to ask the question of, well, my administrators, my people who are seasoned veterans, how are they going to be able to adjust? Because maybe for the longest time, they've been operating off of tribal knowledge. Maybe they've been operating off of the fact that they've worked in that same building for the past 15 years. And so they just know how things work. Now, all of a sudden, things are changing. So you got to think about the impact on the operations team on the floor, making it as streamlined as possible for them to understand, hey, these are steps you now either no longer have to do. These are decisions that we're taking out of your hands because it makes it easier. Or these are decisions that we're putting into your hands because we know you can make the right decision to make the automation work effectively downstream. Because an automation doesn't necessarily have to be a robot moving around. It could be a background process where typically an operator would have had to look at certain data points and utilize that 15 years of tribal knowledge in order to make those decisions. Well, what if that person decides to go get a different job? Now you run into an issue of, well, all that tribal knowledge left with them. So automations can be as simple as taking those type of processes and turning them into a piece of software that executes that job. When you do run into those, you have to ask, how are my people interacting with it? And then I think the other big point to keep in mind all the time is, regardless of how perfect you might plan it, as we were talking about, things are inherently going to go wrong. So when something doesn't work exactly properly, how do my people go about fixing this? What's the steps to resolve the issue? Where do they go look for the problems? Who do they call? What do they do in the meantime, right? So I think that those are all important questions to ask and make sure that you're getting the proper answers to them, because otherwise you could find yourself 6 months into an automation project and not having thought through one of those variables.
Great advice. And then on the IT side, I think there's some overlap there, but from an IT group perspective, if folks are looking to start an automation project in some of their environments,
yep,
what are the questions they should be asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my experience, most IT groups are very adept at asking the proper questions as it impacts their ability or their environment. But I mean, some of the top line questions, some of the more basic stuff is, how is the system deployed? How is the piece of software deployed? Is it an on-premise? Is it a SaaS or a cloud solution? what are the security requirements? How do you adhere to ours? If I'm the customer, how can you adhere to our security requirements? A lot of customers maybe struggle to have their own individual security requirements well documented so that they can provide them to different vendors and say, these are the things that we need you to adhere to. I think it's really important for most customers to remember that like they are ultimately the customer, right? So what gets done and how it gets done in a lot of ways can be dictated by the customer. And so having your wish list, having it written down and being able to present that to different vendors, I think is an important piece to remember as you start pursuing an automation journey, because the more information you can provide to somebody on the front end, the easier it's going to make things on the back end. And then the last thing I would say is what's really, really important to do, especially from an IT group, again, is what do I do when things go wrong, right? Everybody, one of the things we do in solution architecture is mapping out the workflows and mapping out the processes that are going to support the automation on site. We term the way we're trying to accomplish things, we always term that as the happy path. We can figure out the happy path in about 5 minutes. It's everything else, right, that takes up the most amount of time. So the 98%, we accomplished that in about 5 minutes. And then it's that 2% of edge cases that we're like, okay, we need to drill into each of these little details, because we have to understand if something doesn't go quite right, if we short pick something on the floor, how does that data flow back into the system and get back to the WMS so that those records are properly updated, so that the inventory is properly tracked, so that we're updating the customer's order properly, because any missteps in those areas, and ultimately you short a customer or you short a vendor or however that works for them, they can cost you money, right? And so we need to be asking ourselves at every step of the process, okay, if something goes wrong here, how do we react to it? What is the system going to do? And what does the data flow look like to support that?
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brian. Before I let you go, we're going to ask one more question, and that is, from your perspective, your experience, which you so graciously shared with us today, what would you say is the biggest misconception when it comes to deploying automation across the supply chain?
I think that that's a really great point. It's a good question, because in my mind, I think that what most customers that I've interacted with tend to discount is the uniqueness of their environment. I can't tell you how many customers I've interacted with that are like, oh yeah, we're like every other retail shop, or we're like every other food and beverage company. And that is, while there are common themes across those verticals specifically, I would say that there's definitely more uniqueness to each individual environment than what people give a lot of credit to. Those businesses operate in that way for a reason. There's a value-added reason for the way that they're doing certain things, and don't discount that when mapping out your processes and trying to fit automation into them, or adapting your processes to enable automation, because your environment is definitely unique. There's something that you do that nobody else does, and you can't overlook that, and you can't take that for granted. So bring up everything that you possibly can, because you never know what you could bring up that might cause a vendor or cause an automation provider to say, oh, we can meet that need.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you for joining.